Hi, and welcome to the Democracy Lab. This is Aaron Gozum. I'm a PhD student in communication at UC San Diego. And here today we have with us Dr. Helga Tawil, who's an associate professor of media, culture, and communication at NYU, and Middle East and Islamic studies. Right? And so welcome.
Thank you.
It's nice to have you here today.
It's great to be here. It's great to see you again, Aaron.
Yeah, you too. It's been a while, but it's been really nice to see you. So maybe we could start by just hearing about like yourself and like, how would you describe your research, but also not just like what, but like, how you came to do the kind of research that you do.
Okay. I mean, that's a big question.
Well, I know that you study a lot of stuff around media and technology, but also like culture and politics as it pertains to like the Middle East and Palestine specifically. I know that I remember when I was at NYU, I took like the core seminar with you, which was more kind of cultural studies heavy, but I remember you were teaching like undergrad something around like coffee.
Right.
I know when, after we became friends on Facebook, I remember you posted something about like some pigeons or something.
Right.
So you have an eclectic range of things that you do, but I'm curious how you might tie that all together.
Okay, I guess maybe the thing that ties things together is the study of media and communication and culture, which is like the name of the department that at least I work in, which in certain ways I think gives you flexibility to study anything that you want because everything can be justified as like culture or media or communication. But no, okay, so more seriously, I think for a very long time now, I've been mostly interested in a way, I would say, questions of space, questions of kind of architecture, questions of what that means as a human being. Also, like how do you kind of navigate or transpire that kind of space? How does one use space in order to control other people and so on? So I think a lot of my interests, I think, start from there. I am a person who grew up in many different places and moved around a lot as a kid and then eventually also as an adult. And so I think it made me very aware of borders, right? And kind of things like, oh, you need a visa to go to this country, or you need a visa to go to that country. You need a permit. You need this. You need that. And so kind of moving around a lot, I think on the one hand I was really interested in these sort of questions of space and mobility and so on, but also kind of continuously confronted with impassable kind of spaces and zones and so on. So I think very broadly I would say that's kind of what and drives maybe a lot of my interest. It most often lands like geographically, physically in Palestine, in the Palestinian territories, which is an environment that is filled with borders and checkpoints and walls and all kinds of sort of, I don't know, for lack of a better term, like no-go zones, right, or sort of buffer zones or spaces that are inaccessible. And the more one spends time there, the more one realizes that kind of the forcing of immobility, if I can call it that, like the forcing of people or having people forced in place and being stuck in place and not being able to move from one end of town, for example, to another, or even just sort of outside of that territory, is not just simply done through kind of physical architectural means, but through all kinds of other kind of mechanisms. And here, I think, and this, to me, sort of ties back to questions of like media, technology, and so on. So sort of looking at things like how cell phones kind of function as borders, how cell phones, they're mobile, we carry them around. But also if we kind of dig a little deeper, if we look at things like their infrastructure, there are also ways to kind of limit where a phone call can be made, to what other kind of network that can be made. These aren't maybe questions that we think about in the U.S. because, I don't know, companies connect to each other and it doesn't matter if you live in Colorado or California or wherever else, like you can still connect. But in the Palestinian territories, it matters. Like if you live inside of the West Bank or inside of Gaza or inside of Israel, and it matters what communications network you're allowed to access. So I think a lot of my interests were, in a way like about space, but also about what does it mean to kind of move through space, and what kinds of mechanisms sort of stop one kind of from moving into space. I think I've also kind of been a person who's always had a very wide range of interests, and I also get bored really quickly with stuff. And so to me, teaching has been like this kind of area where it's just fun to explore different things. So yeah, I teach the things that I have to teach, like the core course that we did together. And I love that, like sort of doing the theory and stuff like that. But every once in a while, it's just really fun to kind of teach courses about they're related, and there's like a logic to how I got there, but on the surface, it's like, why is this woman teaching a class about coffee? Why is this woman teaching a class about pigeons? Why is this woman teaching a class about turnstiles? So there's a logic, but, there are also kind of ways for me to just kind of go with the flow.
Yeah, I get that. Thanks for sharing.
Sure.
I like that you've started by emphasizing space, which is really interesting because I remember you wrote something about checkpoints as time. And I think in that essay, you talk about like checkpoints as these kinds of chains of islands, or like a temporal like archipelago. And so I'm kind of curious, like how have you noticed that transition for yourself from moving from like questions about space, and then also how this relates to time?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think a lot of it is really because all of my questions almost seem to start in Palestine, okay? And so Palestine is really this place where you are constantly confronted with mechanisms that try to stop you from moving. Okay, that's number one. Palestine is also kind of like a conflict about land and territory. So sort of questions of space, questions of geography, questions of movement, mobility, access are kind of fundamental in terms of what is happening there. So to begin with, I feel like everything that I encounter in sort of Palestine, Israel, I necessarily sort of see through the question of geography, through the question of space, territory, land, and everything that connects to that, right? So access, mobility, and so on. It's also a place that's been kind of pockmarked. I don't know if that's the right word.
I don't know this word.
Like something that exists everywhere, like little pimples everywhere, right? Like they're like, yeah, I think of checkpoints. It's like they're like pimples all over the land of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, right? And so I think the first time I encountered a checkpoint was, I don't know, like 2001 or something. And it was like this fascinating place, like in the way that something ugly and horrible can be fascinating. It was that kind of fascination. And so I've ended up spending a lot of time sort of studying checkpoints, observing them, taking pictures, filming, and so on. And yeah, they're obviously about controlling movement over space. But it also kind of occurred to me that particularly as they've transformed over time, that they're not just simply stopping people from moving back and forth spatially, they're also about stopping people temporally, in that it's a way to kind of keep people where they are, right? And it's a way to kind of divide people up, because everybody has to, not a lot of people have to go through checkpoints, and not a lot of people are given permission to go through checkpoints. But those that do are really kind of atomized within the checkpoint, right? So everybody nowadays has to go individually. You have to go through these automated remote-controlled turnstiles that you don't have control over. You go through one set of turnstiles, and then you go through another set of turnstiles, and then another set of turnstiles. So you're kind of separated, if you want, from everything that's around you, but also from everyone else that's around you. The deeper, if I can say that, the deeper you go into the checkpoint. And so I began to see it as a way to kind of stop time for people. And more than that, a way to, as a kind of microcosm of what is happening to the sort of Palestinian nation, or the Palestinian condition, as one that's continuously sort of segregated from everything around it, or, where people are segregated from each other, and where an outcome or a solution is perpetually farther and farther away, right? So it's a bit of like Palestine is sort of stuck in the in the turnstile or in the checkpoint. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it does.
Yeah.
I'm interested in the whole archipelago thing because, well, that's kind of a condition of like, you know, Filipino life too. It's like this, but when I was reading your essay, I just remember thinking about, it just made me think of the archipelago as like something that is, you know, it's coherent, it's unified, but it's also something that's fragmented. And that was kind of an interesting thing that I feel like you were doing in the essay. It was like thinking about like how something like the turnstile like is a kind of, I don't know, aesthetic mediation of this like larger normative arrangement of like power and social relations in Palestine. And so I thought that was really interesting. I'm interested by like connecting this idea of like how you're thinking about time here with like the talk earlier today, where we were talking about how like, you know, Palestinian lives are becoming mediated and rendered into like data objects. And in that sense, I was thinking, you know, like, it kind of sounds corny, but it's just like this idea of like lifetimes, right? Like, and have you read Nefertiti Tadiar's work?
Yeah.
So I've been like really like kind of obsessed with her most recent book, Remaindered Life, and in it she talks about lifetimes and like this idea how it's kind of like a Marxist idea of like living labor, and like this idea that like she conceptualizes, you know the difference between like the kinds of labor that we do or the activities that we do for like social needs or social use, and versus something that we do for wage labor or exchange value. And so in some way that's kind of how I was thinking about this as well, as like, you know, this idea of like how the turnstile is a mediation of that like dispossession of Palestinian lifetimes. And it's a dispossession not of like actual wage labor, but it's a dispossession of it's a debilitation of their like social reproductive capacities to be able to sustain Palestinian life, Palestinian culture, that kind of thing. And so,
I think you're, I mean, I think you're saying it beautifully, right? I think that's kind of it. Is that yes, it's a kind of levels of alienation, if you want to call it that as well, right? So it's really a way of sort of continuously kind of severing, right? Which you can think of alienation as a sort of severing process itself, right? As a kind of sort of distancing from whether it's labor or the means of production or whatever else, right? And here I think there's also this kind of element of it kind of connects back to the archipelago, right? In that it's all about sort of making islands of people in this case, right? Everybody becomes their own island. Everybody's completely disconnected from everybody else. And I think that so for me, like the figure, if you want, it's the figure, but it's also like the object of the turnstile becomes this kind of fascinating thing to actually think through, right? And so to me, it's kind of this example of like, so this kind of research begins at a checkpoint, and all sorts of whatever writing and so on happens because of the checkpoint. But then eventually suddenly I'm thinking about turnstiles and, what might it mean to kind of write something like a cultural history of the turnstile, right? Not just simply in Palestine, but everywhere. Right? So I feel like I end up thinking about all sorts of, I guess, I'm going to say objects, although I don't necessarily mean it as objects, but all sorts of things, often from the checkpoint out, which is also kind of so ironic because the checkpoint's all about keeping things in, not letting things out.
I mean, but that's interesting because I think it's kind of what you were talking about today. Is like your work is role modeling this idea that, these objects or these culture, whether it's coffee or pigeons or turnstiles, it's trying to find something beyond like the grid of knowledge.
Oh, I never thought of that.
The grid of representations. Yeah. It's this kind of idea that maybe you're thinking of like alternative modes of like perceptibility and sensibility that could come out of that experience. That like, because like to be in, like I saw the pictures in that essay, and like they're so narrow and so confined, and like it feels like bleak. And I think like in some way,
Well,
like
it is. It
how-
doesn't just feel. I mean,
Yeah.
it is bleak. Yeah.
But like, how do we think in those ways? You know, how do we
Right.
think through those senses? And yeah, so that's
Yeah.
kind of where I started thinking about like your talk today. I was like, it's interesting how, you know, this idea that there's these screens through which we encounter, like Gaza, but
Mhm.
also it's like it makes me think about how do those screens also mean? Because I was wondering. Okay, so maybe you can explain more because I kind of arrived late, but.
Okay.
We were talking about encounters as something that was physical, right? Or maybe not. Wait, so
Not necessarily.
yeah,
no,
not okay, cool. Because kind of where I was going was like I feel like it's the screens that set up like the encounter. Is that right?
Yeah, I guess that they've become the space where the encounter happens.
I see.
Right?
Okay.
So, like, if I think of the encounter between a Palestinian and the Israeli regime, it happens more and more on a screen as opposed to, I don't know.
I see. Yeah, that makes sense. So then, and so it's interesting then to think about like how then for that encounter happens between Palestinian and Israelis because of technological mediation, but also how we on this side, you know, of the world also experience it in that kind of mediation. And that makes me also think then, oh, like how could I analyze or decipher that mediation kind of the same way that you do with like the turnstiles? Do you see what I'm saying? Is that a weird?
No, you got to repeat.
Okay, so like
Sorry, it's been a long day.
no, it's okay. No, I totally get it. But I like it was just a parallel that I was seeing where
Yeah.
I was like, okay, like how people like in the US
Yeah.
are like have observed the last several months or so
Right.
have been through this framework of ceasefire, right? It's just like, oh, let's go to our political representatives to like talk about like how Palestinians deserve human rights. It's kind of this like it stays within this more or less
Framework
liberal
or-
political
okay,
framework.
yeah.
But I think then how I was understanding what you were trying to move toward was like, is it something like, is it really just a matter of like how we're representing them like in language? Or is there something more to this in terms of like perception and the senses and how that might be what is rendered excess to those political grids of knowledge, right? Or those epistemological frames that tell us how to understand or how to make sense of the events that are unfolding.
Yeah, I mean, I think now I don't want to say I'm confused, but I don't even know if my own thoughts were sort of very clear. But I was kind of thinking about how everything that we know and that we see of Gaza, like over the past 6 months, but even before that, has only been through increasing layers of distance, if I can call it that, right?
Mm.
Increasing layers of technology, increasing layers of mediation, more and more screens, if you want, right? So that reality on the ground, or you know what a Palestinian even is, or who a Palestinian even is, becomes so far removed through all of these kind of layers, if you want, right? So it's a bit like the turnstiles.
Mm-hmm.
You have to go through something like 6 different turnstiles to pass one checkpoint. So it's a bit like, yeah, maybe each kind of technology, if I can call it that, is a bit like a turnstile, right? It's like one step more removed from where you're trying to go. And so there's walls, there's buffer zones, there's, the views through drones, there's what we end up viewing through whatever, Instagram and so on. So I think I was just trying to think through what does it mean when a space is increasingly inaccessible physically, and made that way on purpose, and in which, or not in which, but that, or so the space that is increasingly inaccessible and made so on purpose. And the only way for us to interact with that space and with whatever is in there is through, kind of technologies that are very violent in their use, but also that seem to. It's almost like there's so little difference between a drone's view and our view on Instagram. I mean, they're both informed by AI. They're both sort of forms of data. They're both ways of quote unquote targeting or framing a Palestinian. They're both the only way that we are engaging with Palestinians because they've been sort of hidden behind 6 layers of turnstiles and more. Right? I think maybe that's sort of what I was trying to think through.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
That's where I was. The reason why I was kind of moving in this direction of like what we can. Basically, from that, I was thinking, okay, what can we do to move away from like? Is the answer to close that distance? Is the answer like? That's kind of what I was thinking. Is just like, I think Gary Fields was also giving like a talk just not that long ago, like a month ago, and we had a faculty discussion about, or a department discussion about like, what is there to do from where we are,
Right.
and I think that we want to do something that's so immediate where all we know is, let's call up our representatives, let's post on social media, and so I guess the talk and like what you were just sharing today, like it just made me think about like how, I don't know, what would you think is like a way of, this is a very big question I'm realizing now. It's like, and it's
which
one
I'm
that
not
has
going to have an
plagued
answer
me.
to because none of us have an answer to it. But,
Yeah, I know.
But
Yeah.
I think it's, I guess maybe I'll try to sort of answer in 2 ways, right? One is on a kind of academic level, by which I mean how we're thinking about this, right? And what kind of knowledge production we're trying to create that's inevitably going to be created about Gaza, right? That's already being created about what's going on. On a certain level, I guess I want to know how is it that we can move beyond the epistemic frameworks that we have used so far, because clearly they may help us understand something, but they certainly don't help us in preventing certain things from happening, right? Which,
well, maybe another way we can enter this is this is kind of a long time ago, but I read a different essay that you've written, and I remember it being about like Palestinian culture, like cultural production, and it was something about like movies and music or something, but it was basically like, I think the argument was that like, it's their cultural practices are a form of political resistance simply because of, it's kind of a political resistance that's on an ontological level.
right.
And I think the questions that we're having right now, or at least and is about like the epistemological frame, right? And like how we come to know, but your work on like the turnstiles thing made me think, is it something beyond just simply how we know, but also like how we do things, how we practice, how we perceive, how we sense things. And I guess, that's when that quote that you were talking about like how no one's hearing the door, that made me think, then is our problem our mode of listening? Is our mode like, do you see where I'm like getting at here? And
I think it's kind of both, right? I think it's, I
guess you can't separate though.
Yeah, I think like I also just sort of go back and forth between things, right? On the one hand, I feel like, we have to sort of figure out how to move beyond our, whatever you want to call them, epistemic frameworks, the ways that we're kind of asking questions, the ways in which we're sort of tying tying things together or how we kind of understand relations. So there's a part of me that feels like we're clearly, or not, maybe not clearly, but for me, I feel like there's this impasse, right? Maybe I shouldn't say we, but so I'm stuck, right? And I just don't know how, and I'm stuck in my thinking is what I mean. And I just don't know how to sort of move beyond this stuckness. And so and I wonder if that's in a certain way perhaps an argument that I'm making about where we are politically. And by we here, I mean, well, initially I mean Palestinians, but now I'm thinking, well, maybe it's just the whole world that I'm really sort of thinking of we, of like, what kind of political moment are we in which we kind of feel stuck in certain ways, right? So I'm trying to think of how do we move beyond that. What is it going to take to kind of move beyond? How do we sort of reframe, rethink? You know, I don't know. It's almost like it's like we need to shake it a little bit and kind of somehow start going in a different, or maybe a lot, and go in a different direction. So I think there's one part of me that's sort of struggling to sort of deal with that question. There's another part of me that I think is much more pessimistic, dystopic, of this is the world that we live in. And we are separated and segregated increasingly in technological ways, right? Each one of us behind our own screens. But rather than see that as like some sort of pathological state or like somehow we're missing out, is there a way to embrace that? Is there a way to say like, this is the world that we live in. We are separated by screens, by turnstiles, by so on. And it ties back to that first question. And so if we accept that this is the world, and if we accept that these are our conditions, how then do we need to learn how to then move forward, right? So I feel like, you know, it's almost like letting go of some sort of nostalgia for like the past. It's letting go of like, face-to-face interaction is really important. It's letting go of all sorts of things that, you know, I feel like we're that I feel like we're sort of stuck in.
I see.
And I wonder what would it mean to embrace to embrace data, to embrace screens, to embrace media, in all of their kind of problems. But rather than, again, sort of like rather than see them as somehow lacking, what can they provide us instead?
Yeah, I can see what you're saying now. Because I'm thinking back to how you were saying how mediation could be thought of as a kind of alienation, but also that is a mode of like, it's like producing difference. And I'm kind of thinking of it back to the archipelago stuff and like this kind of Edward Glissant kind of poetics of relation, and like how that relationship or the totality is built through the production of, you know, violent difference. And so I like kind of what you're saying here is like this idea that like it's not about just erasing the difference. It's about how, like, what do we do and how do we reside in that break, right? How do we reside in the wake of that violence? And like, that's really interesting.
And I don't have an answer. I mean, I don't have an answer, but I think there's a part of me that's saying like, I think maybe those are some of the questions that we need to be asking of what.
Well, you know, this is kind of going a little off tangent, but I've been reading this other book, which is called There's a Disco Ball Between Us.
That's a cool title.
Yeah, right? Yeah. And it's by this guy named Jafari S. Allen, and he's this like black gay theorist, and he is writing about the disco ball as like a metaphor for like, you know, the world, and this idea that like, you know, the world is fractured into numerous tiny mirrors, and how we understand the world, how we make sense of it depends on where you're standing in the disco, depends on where you're dancing. And that's kind of how I started thinking about what you were just saying, is like this idea that like those... Like,
each one of us is like a little piece in that sort of bigger mosaic. Whatever, right?
Yeah, and like how maybe the question then is not about trying to fix the ball,
right?
But maybe trying to understand how is it that we're related, and how, and maybe through finding those relations, we can figure out, like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I think that makes perfect sense. I think maybe our job is like, how do we read the, what do you call them, like the rays of light that are kind of bouncing off of the disco ball, right? So
Yeah.
rather than sort of focus on the ball as, oh, it's this mosaic made up of little pieces that aren't connected and it's not perfectly round and blah, blah, blah. So rather than focus on that, it's like, well, but it's producing something. And it's producing these, I don't know, are they called rays? I don't know.
Or refractions, maybe.
Yeah, refractions and so on. So it's like, maybe that's what we should be kind of thinking through, or maybe that's where, I don't know, I guess I'm looking for hope, right? I'm looking for some kind of like political hope. So maybe that's where political hope can be found, is by chasing those refractions as opposed to chasing each piece of the mosaic and lamenting the fact that we're all, separated.
That makes me ask you. It's up to you if you want to answer this question, but I've been thinking a lot about, like, in my own work, I'm thinking about the relationships between, like, queer Filipino struggles and, like, anti-imperialist struggles that often take a kind of nationalist approach to doing their organizing. And I've seen in the news when it comes to, like, Palestine, like, there is a lot of pinkwashing that's out there. And so I'm kind of curious, like, how do you see those articulations or between those different refractions, if that makes sense? Like, do you think, like, because that's something that I've been really trying to work through, is, like, how to overcome this idea that those things are separate issues, as opposed to them being something that are related and that are
you know what, I can't help but think of, like, one of the, I can't say it's a beauty of this moment because everything feels so ugly, but one of the things that's been kind of astounding, if you want, is to see all of the different, well, I almost want to say like refractions, but it's to see all of the different, I guess, let's call them sort of solidarity groups, right? Or interest groups, or kind of, all the different sort of formations that seem to, that are kind of responding, if you want, to what's happening in Gaza or to what's happening in Palestine, right? So think everything from, like, queer rights to, I don't know, like those football fans in Scotland, right? To, I don't know, I'm somehow blank right now, but, Cuba, of course, like the government of Cuba, of course, to abolition, those who are sort of like working for the abolition of prisons, to obviously sort of like indigenous movements and indigenous rights, to, I don't know, the BLM movement, like so many different things are kind of, I don't know what you want to call it, kind of circling around or sort of have solidarity with. I think there's so much recognition of how much Palestine kind of speaks to these, right, at the same time, and speaks to these both as in recognition of these forms of oppression that are shared across different groups, different geographies, but also this kind of hope for, like, somehow a struggle, right, and kind of like these different sort of forms of resistance. So I think it's been, it's like it's a disco ball, right? Like there's suddenly all of this that's sort of kind of turning around the sort of question of Gaza. I think for me sometimes I kind of wonder, like, whether we end up, and this is perhaps precise, what I'm about to say is precisely the kind of thinking that I'm arguing should stop, right? Which is the moment that there's so many, I'm going to call them like stars around this orbit, right? So like if Gaza or Palestine is the orbit, like all of these other things that are kind of moving around it, like, do we end up losing sight of what the initial struggle or ask or problem is, because it's suddenly become connected to so many other things? right? And so that's why I'm saying, like, oh, I don't even want to think that way, because I feel like that's sort of really problematic. It's kind of going back to, it's like, it sounds so nationalistic almost, right? Of like, well, maybe the question is not about only one form of oppression or only one struggle, but about all of these together, right? And I think that is the sort of, I don't know. I think that is this kind of moment that we're in of how I think we understand intersectionality, for example. I think it's a question of, as odd as it sounds, it's almost like, how do we centralize that? How do we kind of bring this all of this energy back together in order to actually overturn the system that we're living in?
Yeah. What I'm hearing in what you were just saying is like there's this like tension between how people understand what that intersectionality is, though, and how some people kind of think of it as, oh, we're all oppressed, so then we're all Palestinians, right?
Yeah.
And then, but that's kind of problematic too.
Right, exactly.
And so, but it's more about going back to kind of what you were saying about this mediation and embracing the violence of that, is this idea of maybe focusing on I guess in a Kathy Cohen kind of sense, is like the relations of power between these different non-normative subject positions. And so that's kind of how I was thinking about like what you were just, the tension that you were saying. It kind of sounds like so far what we've talked about is like, you know, your research and the journey from like moving from, you know, using media objects really, or not objects, I know you just said not.
But
like,
I mean,
in some way,
they are,
like things that can tell you or index some broader arrangement of like, you know, of how relations of dominance and subordination have been articulated in Palestine. And then we moved into this discussion about like, okay, what is there to do? What is, you know, and like what kinds of modes of thinking, whether that's the disco ball, whether that's intersectionality, whether that's, you know, I don't know, ways of thinking that can exceed those epistemological frames. I guess in some sense what we've done is we've moved from this like analysis kind of focus to this like activist focus. I'm kind of curious now just to move into like more of your artistic work, because I know you've done maybe some, I just wanted to give space if you want to talk about like, I don't know, like your documentary
it's funny, it's not funny, but it's actually very much related to that, right? I think I ended up, I mean, there's always been a kind of visual bend, if you want. Like I not for as long as I remember, but certainly since I was a teenager, you know, I've had a camera in hand, right, whether video or still. So I think there's always been this long kind of history, if you want, of like interest in the visual and in creating art and so on. But I think I've sort of come back to that precisely because of this sense of stuckness, right, and this sort of sense of impasse, of it increasing, you know, and I think a lot of it, for me, a lot of it kind of comes from dealing with Palestine and dealing with, you know, being stuck in the checkpoint, right? Like actually and metaphorically. And this feeling of somehow language is just not doing it enough for me, or somehow language is just not able to really express the kinds of frustrations, but also is unable to even just describe what is going on in Palestine. And this is before Gaza, or like, you know, I mean, before Gaza today. I mean, a lot of my own sense of impasse has revolved around Gaza, in that it felt like a space that is just simply unexplainable. It's just unfathomable what was happening there already 10 years ago. And so it felt like this kind of move of wanting to move away from writing, because somehow language is just not the way or the space or the form through which to try to understand this. And so I think I've been trying to kind of experiment with like these different forms of knowledge production, if I can call them that, right? Like different forms of expression, all of which kind of feel like, they're not doing enough, like, or none of them are kind of adequate enough, which maybe is why I'm beginning to ask these questions of how can we move beyond where we are, right? So I feel like I've tried to move beyond writing. I've tried to move beyond taking photos or filming. Collage has been a really interesting kind of...
it's kind of like a zine kind of thing.
Yeah, but it's also... it's very messy. It's like you can bring in whatever you want into it. You can take what exists and it can still be there, but you can also completely transform it into something else. And you can bring in things that are seemingly completely unrelated and create kind of one piece. And so there's something to me about collages sort of really interesting. And it's layered, right? So there's something about collages kind of really interesting.
Yeah.
It's also kind of indecipherable in its own way, and so I don't know if it's an adequate, if you want, sort of quote unquote representation of Gaza or of Palestine, but it's an attempt at trying to do that, right? I think it's a recognition of a recognition of like the limits of language, the limits of representation, the limits of the limits.
That's really interesting. I think like this idea of limits, I mean, like it's kind of like contradictory to like what a lot of people think about when it comes to art, right? This idea that people think of art usually as something that's about pure possibility. It's transcending, but here we're kind of saying something about how it traces like the limits of how we're able to think and how we're able to know something. And so that's like that. I don't know. That was an interesting insight that you just made. Do you have current like collage projects that you're working on, or future projects you have in mind?
Oh God, I don't know. I feel like I'm a person who has like a gazillion projects going on at once.
Yeah.
It's just the question of which one am I going to end up, I don't know, having time for or doing. I mean, I think there's a couple of sort of sort of visual art projects that I'm trying to think through. I've also been trying to figure out how to make kind of more digital. And when I say I do collage, I mean all of it is like very sort of low tech. It's like paper, glue, paint, whatever, right? Paper. I said paper. But I'm trying to sort of think through how I can kind of do maybe more sort of digital forms where I can bring in things like video, audio, text, and so on, and figure out how to kind of collage those together, right? So not as separate entities, but is there a way to really kind of, I don't know, mash up, I guess, maybe, to make, but like actually make a mess of them. I mean, that's part of what I like about collage is that it's a very messy process. I mean, like, I don't know, for me, the way I do it at least is very messy.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if there's a way for me to kind of do things digitally in a very messy way, right? In which you see the glue seeping out, you see the paint dripping, you see the ripped paper, but is there a way to do that with audio and video and, I don't know, websites, whatever? So I don't know, that's something that I want to try to kind of explore.
That makes sense. I mean, my music making is very messy.
Is it?
So I have voice notes everywhere. I have all these different books of lyrics. So I definitely think that, I think it's interesting how you're talking about mess makes me think about its relationship to like not mess or like order and like how like it's maybe constitutive of that order or creating that order. It's a kind of a queer way of thinking about this. Yeah. But how you're like, because you're saying like trying to move into like the digital space with the collaging and how you're thinking about like how to play with mess there, right? And so you're moving into the mediation. So it's like this relationship that you're forming between the very thing that is causing some violence, but trying to make sense of, I don't know, does that make sense? Like it's, yeah, I don't know. But in any case, like it does make me think about the collage as like another way of thinking about the disco, or as a thinking about the interrelations and the fragments and how putting them in proximity to one another might create some different vision or different way of thinking about it. And Well,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, I'm not going to keep you on this podcast for
Oh,
that
no, that's
long,
okay. It's been fun.
But it's been, really nice
Yeah.
chatting about this. And I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to say before
No,
we wrapped it up.
thank you. Thank you
Yeah.
so much. It's
Yeah.
been great chatting.